When I was at university in Australia, I took a couple of years off my studies and moved from Melbourne to Sydney to work in a not for profit. This particular not for profit had for years been given the use of a really old, run-down office in an almost derelict building. Thing was, it was in the middle of Sydney, so the location was great. We had little money to run the organisation, so we were thankful for the space. One stifling hot and humid summer evening, I was working back really late. Must have been about 2 a.m. in the morning, and I was in a room at the back of the office. There was a long hallway connected to where I was working with the front of the office. Given how old the office was, there was no AC. I had all the windows open to catch any breeze and to try to stay cool. I remember working and sweating. Then, it happened. I was typing away at a computer when I was suddenly encircled by a freezing cold. The temperature felt like it fell by 30 degrees Celsius in a second. I hugged myself against it. There was frost on my breath when I exhaled. It was 100% like the sixth sense. Then, I shot up straight in my chair as I had an overwhelming sensation that someone was behind me. I knew someone was there, looking at me. Even typing this, I have the same chill pulsing through my body, like I did that night. My first thought was that someone had broken in and I was about to be attacked. Spinning quickly around in my chair, I looked behind me, but no one was there. I called out to hear if anyone would reply. Nothing. I called my colleagues' names, thinking that perhaps one of them had come into the office to work. Again, nothing. Slowly, I got up from my chair and started checking all the rooms of the office. I walked down the hallway to the front of the office to check if the front door was locked. It was. Standing in reception, I shook the feeling of unease off as best as I could and started heading back down the hallway to recommence. When I got to the end of the hallway, the same feeling hit me. I absolutely knew that someone was behind me, and they were looking at me. I froze and decided to spin around quickly to confront whatever or whoever was there. Then, I saw him. He was a little boy, perhaps 5 or 6 years old. He was only visible from the head to where his legs began. His legs were not there. He was kind of see-through, but I could definitely make him out. We made eye contact. He smiled at me, turned to his right and kind of ran off and disappeared. I was in shock. I couldn't believe what I had just seen. I'd worked in that office for months. Nothing like this had happened before. I didn't know what to do, but I no longer felt afraid. He was, well, I guess, a nice little kid. He just wanted to say hi, is what I thought. I then said out loud, "Hi there, I've nearly finished. I'll be heading off soon." I wasn't expecting a response, and I didn't get one. I finished up and left the office, saying goodbye as I locked the front door. Months later, I was at a pub where several generations of people who had worked at the same non-profit, in the office, had gathered for a kind of reunion. As the night proceeded, around the table, about a dozen of us all retold our stories of the little boy that haunted the office. We all instinctively, unquestionably knew he was a young boy. All of their stories were as visceral as mine. It was then that I found out that the little boy had been given a name. His name was Ravi. I've been wanting to share this experience for years. It's easily the most visceral experience I've ever had, and it started with an innocent after-work drink when I was working in London, quite some years back. I'd agreed to meet an old work colleague at a pub on the Strand in London, near Waterloo Bridge. I'd never been there before, and the pub was cosy, small. I think it was called the Savoy Tup or Tap. My ex-colleague, let's call him Tim, was there when I arrived, and he managed to get a small table and a couple of seats, tucked into a corner of the pub besides the bar. We were a bit cramped, but were thankful to be able to sit. After our first pint, Tim went to get another round. That's when I saw her. As impossible as it was, I felt that there was suddenly someone standing in the small space between me and the wall. There's no way anyone could have squeezed past me without me noticing. They literally would have had to climb over me. I turned around, and against the wall there was a young woman, early 20s, staring down at me. I knew she was a ghost. Thing was, she wasn't see-through at all. I saw her like I saw any other patron in the pub. She was dressed in clothing that I picked to be from the mid to late 80s, a bit goth in style, all black. She said nothing. She was just looking down at me, staring intently. I was frozen in place, just staring back at her. A few moments passed and I spied Tim out of the corner of my eye, beers in hand. I thought perhaps he could see her too. Tim sat and I turned to him, wide-eyed. He put the beers down and said, "What's wrong?" I turned back to the wall and she was gone. I asked, "Did you see anything beside me?" He looked at me strangely, replied, "No," and I changed the subject. I hadn't known Tim that well previously, so I didn't want to act weird. Soon enough, it was my shout, and as I got up, I also took the chance to head to the toilet. I recall they were up a flight of stairs, and I remember a really weird feeling in the upstairs toilet as well. I tried to shake it all off, so I could enjoy the evening. Heading back to the bar, I ordered, and as the bartender was pouring the beers, I hesitated, but finally asked him something like, "Has there ever been anything weird happen in this pub?" The bartender stopped pouring, looked at me and said, "Did you see her upstairs, did you?" I looked back at him. Motioning over to where Tim and I were sitting, I said, "No, she was over there where I'm sitting. She appeared up against the wall." The bartender replied. "She usually stays up in the bathrooms. That's where most people experience something." Handing the beers over, I was told the story of how a young female bartender in the late 80s had hanged herself in the upstairs toilet of that pub. So before I jump into conclusions, I'd like to ask if someone who knows a little bit about electricity can say why this happens. I've googled all over the internet and I've only found explanations for light flickering in case of LED lights, which is not my case. My house is old, my grandpa's house, and they used to buy loads of bulbs to have just in case. I've been living out of them for the last few years, so there's still the incandescent type. These are the main things I've witnessed. I was once in the bathroom and noticed the light slightly flickering, as if its intensity was varying. I looked at it and it stopped. It hasn't flickered again. I've got a not very old IKEA lamp that has 3 bulbs in my studio room. One evening, 2 of them started to flicker. It also stopped when I looked at the lamp. This was immediately followed by a weird croaking noise. This is the best I can describe it, coming from my bedroom. It was a sound I hadn't heard before in my house, and I'm used to neighbours or even weird noises from the central heating when it's turned on. I felt it was coming specifically from the middle of my bedroom, which was next to the room I was in. I got a bit spooked and called my dad to take my mind off of it. I was in the kitchen another day, thinking about something strange happening from almost 2 years before. I said out loud, "That was a big prank," meaning some spiritual being did it, and the light flickered again. This time, it was a fluorescent tube I changed in recent years. I don't want to read too much into these happenings, but it's something I can't really explain. Either time I checked later the bulbs were properly screwed, which they were. I'd love to hear from someone who could also give a scientific explanation. He was at his house and misplaced his cell. He hasn't had a landline there for about 3 or 4 years, and he doesn't live there regularly anymore and would be a waste of money. He looked for it for a while and didn't find it. So since he couldn't call himself to know where it was, he went to his girlfriend's place and asked her to go with him and call the phone. Eventually they found it and returned to his girlfriend's place. This is when things got weird. His girlfriend receives a call from a relative for something unrelated, and she begins to explain to this person what had just happened. My dad misplacing his phone and she having to go to his place to call it and find it. as my dad had got rid of the landline years before. When she hangs up, apparently a blue screen appears straight away on her phone that reads 92025 XXX invite. This is the old landline number of my dad's house. She didn't have my dad's phone number on her contact list. Even if she had it, how on earth could the phone have gathered it to suggest that number from the voice conversation she had? In any case, it'd show the way the name with the number would have been saved. But still they checked it and she didn't have that number anywhere in her phone. I don't know what kind of screen it was. I asked my dad whether they took a screenshot, but they didn't, as she quickly got out of that screen because she didn't think anything meaningful of it. But my dad got a glimpse of it and he freaked out. Apparently, it wasn't an incoming call screen or anything he had seen before, just a blue screen showing the number and the word invite. They called the old phone number just in case that was a missing call and a pure coincidence. And they got the typical network voice saying that the number wasn't in use by anyone. What do you think about this? Is it by any chance a new feature of smartphones that we don't know about? Is this something paranormal, or big data companies just know too much about us, watch us constantly, and get too smart? So I really love exploring abandoned buildings, especially factories and warehouses. So one day last summer, I asked two of my friends if they wanted to go explore this abandoned factory that I had heard about from a friend. The pictures he showed me really intrigued me and piqued my interest. Surprisingly, they agreed to go with me. They had never gone to any abandoned place and were very hesitant when I asked. So anyways, we get there and park behind the building, and there's a door that's slightly open. They're hesitant to go in, so I walk in first. Immediately, I got a little creeped out. I get this feeling that I've never felt before while I'm in an abandoned building. I feel like I'm not supposed to be there. I know I'm not, because trespassing, I know. But it wasn't like that. Even though I'm really creeped out, I keep walking. There's a set of stairs that we walk up to get to the second floor. On the second floor, I feel fine. The feeling goes away. After we completely explored the second floor, we decided to go back down to the first floor. Now, the first floor is absolutely massive. There's machinery, elevator shafts, and loading docks for trucks. We decide to walk down one of the massive hallways when I get a feeling that I should not go down there. So not wanting to look like a pussy, I just suggest that we should do that last. As soon as we turn around to go away from it, we hear what sounded like a woman singing. We stop walking and listen again. There it is again. It sounded like someone was singing a note and holding it. I know it was not the wind, because it was a very hot day with perfect weather and no wind. As soon as we heard it the second time, panic overflowed all three of us, and we ran out of there as fast as we could. We got back in the car and drove away as fast as possible. I'm pretty skeptical, and I want to believe that it was just a local resident messing with three curious teenagers, but I really don't know. For anyone wondering, this happened in Brownsville, Pennsylvania, at the old brewery. Unfortunately, I do not have pictures inside of the building anymore because I lost them when I got a new phone. The building is pretty cool, and I suggest looking into its history. This experience happened back in 2018, where me and my family, as well as my aunts and cousins, lived in my childhood home. It was a one-story house, with 2 rooms, with the second one being on the back, made out of wood, while the rest is made from stone. It was around midnight when this happened. I was woken up by loud voices of people laughing, talking, and singing. I know that some people would often hear voices upon waking up, and it would usually go away after a minute, right? Well, mine didn't. I was wide awake at this point, and the voices were still there. They got even louder. I listened more closely to what they were talking about, since I'm kind of a nosy person. The more I listened, the more I got freaked out. They weren't talking or even singing in Filipino. I don't know what language they were talking, but they weren't the languages I was familiar with. I know there are many Filipino languages. I heard them, and they aren't close to what I heard. It sounded like they were surrounding the house. I was so freaked out that I wanted to wake up Mom, who was sleeping soundly beside me, but I decided not to. Getting scolded is the last thing I wanted. I tried to sleep after that, and thankfully, I did. The next morning, when we all sat around the dining table and ate breakfast, I asked my cousins if they heard voices last night, since they're night owls. They looked at me confused and said no, but my aunt overheard our conversation and looked at me with wide eyes. "You heard them too?" she asked me. I got chills at this point and was freaking out. I was so overjoyed that I wasn't the only one who heard it and knew I'm not going insane or anything. We talked about it for a while, even told my mom about it, but she dismissed it. She said that they weren't talking in Filipino, just as I knew. Before some of you say that it might be our neighbours being noisy while half of the world is sleeping, let me tell you that I know them pretty well. They'll have their usual karaoke nights somewhere around noon or afternoon until 10 at night, and won't extend any further. If they would, some would have thrown rocks at their roof until they piped down, but my aunt said the voices were still there until 1 a.m. The first alarm, Saturday night. It was verging on 1 a.m, the first night I heard it. My insomnia was preventing me from falling asleep, so what else is there to do but make pointless Amazon purchases and browse Reddit? I was in bed mindlessly scrolling through Reddit when I heard bleep 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 coming from somewhere in my lounge room. When I checked the time, it was 12:52 a.m. I'm a quadriplegic, spinal cord injury when I was 17, so there was no way for me to get out of bed to investigate the origin of this relentless beeping. My hope was that it would stop on its own, as my security camera system has glitched out before and made a similar noise. But good fortune didn't shine in my favour, and the beeping continued for the next hour, leaving me with no choice but to investigate the next day. The alarm would stop on its own after a few hours. I unplugged my security camera on Sunday night before bed to see if that was where the alarm was coming from, and waited to see if that would fix whatever problem was there. Our first encounter, age 14, 2004. I met Greg, fake name, in 2004 after me and my family, my mum, my sister and myself, had moved from Australia to New Zealand for a fresh start a few months prior. My mum is originally from New Zealand, and we moved to the same town she grew up in, which was where I first met Greg. He had dark brown hair and was the most magnetic light blue eyes I'd ever seen. I was instantly taken aback by how utterly gorgeous he was, and more importantly at the time, he had eyes for me too. I distinctly remember one day during lunch when he took me aside and asked if he could walk with me. I'd gotten bullied at my previous school, one of the reasons for the fresh start, so receiving attention from boys was something new to me, but I relished in it. While walking through the courtyard away from the mass of fellow students at the canteen, we talked about nothing in particular. Just the typical boy likes girl idle chit-chat, and that awkward, "I like you, but I'm too shy to say it out loud" vibe. But the rest, as they say, is history. We exchanged numbers and began to hang out more during and after school. What we had, although tumultuous at times, was somewhat epic. In my hormone-riddled mind, at least. The second alarm, Sunday night. I was up late going through my Netflix list when I heard it again. The same alarm at the same time, 12:52 a.m. Damn. So I put in my earplugs like I'd done the night before. I keep earplugs on my nightstand because my cat has a nasty habit of meowing at the bedroom door during the night when he wants to be a little shit, and made a note to investigate the source of the beeping the next day. I was at a loss as to what could be doing this, so I unplugged my digital recorder. That's sure to be it, right? My first. Greg always wore black, usually had on a Slipknot or Static X hoodie, and more often than not adorned a studded necklace and bracelet. Our matching style, I was into a lot of what he was at the time, and my preferred style involved a lot of black, made us stick out like a sore thumb in the small town. But portraying myself as a stereotypical Batgirl by my outside appearance gave me an unexplainable feeling of badassery in my naive way of thinking back then. We would often just walk around town without having a destination in mind, just enjoying each other's company. There was this swimming area along the river that, although popular with the local kids, was not often used during the day. The current of the river was really strong on this part of the river, but there was this section off to the side where the current stopped and the water was slower. There were trees for shade, far away from town that gave us privacy, and the peaceful sound of running water to fill a perfect afternoon with good company. That's when I was first introduced to a somewhat strange kink. We were laying down under a big oak tree that was near the river's edge when he put his ear on my stomach. Caught off guard, I said, okay, and he explained. Listening to the churning sounds of my stomach turned him on or gave him comfort. Even now, 18 years later, I don't fully understand what it was that he got from this. But alas, I had never known any different, so I never saw it as weird. The main reason behind me growing up very open-minded is because of him. My other first was a bit of a train wreck. We wagged school with a friend, Tom, of his, and we went to his friend's house. Flirting turned to touching, which in turn led us to not so casually sneaking into one of the bedrooms in the house and barricading the door shut with boxes to get down to business. I'd never done this before, but I was ready and I wanted it to be with him. So we started, and it was good until Tom's mum arrived home unexpectedly. We were oblivious of this fact until Tom started banging hard on the door, yelling, "Oh crap, my mum's home! What are you doing? Dude, get out of there!" We stopped what we were doing and sheepishly exited the bedroom, to be met with the disappointed and panicked face of Tom, followed shortly by his mother, who was surprised to see her son, who should be at school, and two derelict teens with sex hair and panicked faces. This was one of those situations that's funny as a flip to look back at now, but at the time was mortifying. The last alarm, Monday night. I can't recall what I was doing when the alarm went off on Monday night, but it's safe to assume that I was scrolling through my Netflix or browsing the selection on Reddit for something to do to pass the time. The same alarm at the same time, 12:52 a.m. By this point I was stressing about what was making this alarm go off. If it wasn't the security system or the recorder, what else could it be? I have digital clocks, but I've never set an alarm on them. I don't even know how to. And the last time I'd even touched them was to change the time for daylight savings, which was a month ago. What was causing this? The beginning of the end. Our goodbye. Due to circumstances irrelevant to this story, Greg moved to Australia about a year after we met. And a year after that, I moved to get away from my mother. She's a whole other can of worms. And live with my dad back in Australia. I had Greg's number, so we were still in contact for a while. I suffered a spinal cord injury at the end of 2007 when I was 17, so we were in and out of contact through the years. The last I spoke to him was in 2015. I tried to find him a few times online, but life kept getting in the way. And the reason for his lack of contact came to light recently. Tuesday, the discovery. My questions were answered on Tuesday morning when I discovered the source of this persistent alarm. It was my digital clock. I have no idea how this happened, as nobody has touched or moved it in months. Then that afternoon, I received a message from Greg's cousin. Greg had died that night. He'd been sick for a few years, which I had no clue about because of our lack of communication. I'm not going into too much detail about this for privacy reasons, but I'm sure that your first guess will be the correct one. He passed away peacefully in his sleep the night before. Time of death, 12:52 a.m., age 33. I don't know how to explain this and how it happened or what actually happened. I'm a massive skeptic and don't believe in anything like ghosts or monsters or God, so this whole thing is... I have no words. It was his funeral yesterday, and I got to attend via live stream. It was nice hearing stories about him and his life. Although it was sad and many tears were shed, I'm grateful to have known him. I wouldn't have grown to be the person I am today if it wasn't for him, and the time we shared together. He was a published author, a successful musician, and loved by all who knew him. Although this is the end of a chapter in my life, my story hasn't ended. He taught me to love the little things in life and never give up on my dreams. To quote the dead, what a long, strange journey it's been. Their father owned a dog kennel in Provo, Utah, so their property was big with several buildings on it. It was basically in the shape of a giant upside-down L, with a gravel road going down it. At the beginning of the property was the main house where everyone lived. At one end of the road, before you turn left, were the other two buildings, each on the other side of the gravel road. Then the road went left to a big field they used as a play area for kids and dogs. The road ended at a fence. This is important for later. So I came over to have a sleepover and hang out. I was probably around 12 at the time. After a day of playing around and probably sword fighting with sticks, it was getting time to go to sleep. Cortland and I, we wanted to sleep in one of the kennels at the end of the property. There was a game room there where we could peacefully stay up all night playing video games. Halen liked to sleep and decided to go to the main house. Around 12 AM, Court and I got bored of Oblivion and came up with a plan to make a Molotov cocktail, light it, and break it in the street. We've done this before, and it's become one of our favourite shenanigans. So we got the cocktail ready, with gas, a sock, and an old soda bottle. We go down the gravel road, hop the fence, and go into the neighbourhood street. We lit the cocktail and had our fun stomping out the fire. Here's where it gets creepy. As I'm hopping the fence to get back to their property, I see a black silhouette of a man in a top hat at the other end of the road near one of the buildings. I thought, shoot, his dad woke up and is checking on us. So when I hit the ground, I go full prone. Cortland did the same thing, so I asked if he saw him. Court said yes, and confirmed it was a black figure with the top hat. We both snuck back to the building we were in, wondering why his dad was wearing a top hat. We both felt uneasy and started believing it wasn't his dad. As we got back to the building we were staying in, we looked across the road at the other building. It had a loft and a balcony. On the balcony, there was the silhouette of the man with the top hat. Now this is a kennel, and that kennel had no way to enter without every dog going off like a giant barking alarm system. There was no way anybody could sneak up there without us hearing barking. Ours was a little different, and you could move around easier, although you had to be careful. So because he was standing on the balcony and no dogs went off, we were scared. And even though he was close, he was still all black. We were freaking out now, but wanted to find out what was happening. So we mustered up some courage and snuck close to the kennel to see if we could hear anything. There was music on, upstairs in the loft, old-time saxophone music. We tried to sneak up there as cool as we opened the front door. Some dogs started barking, so we snuck back to the other building. So terrified, we called Halen, who was at the house, to let him know what was happening. He answered, and the conversation went like this. Hey guys, why are you calling me? Are you in the kitchen? No, we're not. We're at the game room, and we think somebody's on the property. He went dead silent for a second, then came back whispering. Guys, I hear footsteps in the kitchen. Please come here and get me. Please. So we grab our knives and run down there. Find Halen hiding in his room, and nobody in the kitchen, or anywhere for that matter. Afterwards, we explain everything to Halen. Reluctantly, we decide to wake up his dad. His dad knows how to shoot pretty well, and decided to grab a .45 Magnum, and we all took a walk to the loft. On the way there, we didn't see anything. No footprints in gravel, nothing. And the dogs barked all the way up to the loft of the kennel. Sure enough, as we got up there, the music was still playing. When we entered the room, we found out there was a radio turned on and it was playing jazz music. But there was no mysterious man in a top hat anywhere to be found. His dad chalked it up to accidentally leaving it on and concluded there was nobody around. We were relieved, but also still freaked out. His dad made us all sleep at the house after that, and I could tell he thought we were paranoid. But when we hopped the fence, Court and I saw the same thing without saying it to each other. Halen did hear something in the kitchen and said that's what woke him up. Minutes later we called him, so we thought it was us getting snacks. So there you have it, my story of a shadow man with a top hat. I've done some reading and there are shadow figures. One of them does have a top hat. He's supposed to symbolise something bad is going to happen, usually with family. I've always believed in the paranormal. I grew up watching Ghost Hunters and Canada's Most Haunted with my mother and siblings. Throughout my 28 years lived thus far, I've had a few experiences that I would call paranormal in nature. Mostly shadow figures and unexplainable sounds or objects moving. Most of the time, I'm able to convince myself it's just my imagination. Environmental components contributed or a potential mental break. But there was this one experience that was too much for me to pass off as nothing. I was probably around 25 at the time, and I was working as a veterinary technician in an old animal hospital. I'd been working there for a few years at that point, and had picked up some of the building's history from co-workers, doctors, and even community members that brought their pets there. A cement brick out front of the building had the date 1904 stamped into it. I know that for the first 30 or so years, the building was just a home. No one ever said anything interesting ever happened to that family, but they sold the house to another family in the 1930s. The new family had turned the front of the home into a butchery and had kept the back and upstairs for living quarters. It was a home and butchery until 1952, when another family bought it. They added an extension on the back, threw up a few more walls and turned the downstairs into a veterinary hospital, but kept the upstairs functioning as a living space. 3 bedrooms with an eat-in kitchen and full bathroom. Very cute little apartment. At the time that I worked there, the upstairs was still a functioning apartment, but no humans were living there. The current practice owner had turned that space into the most wonderful cat boarding facility. It was so bright, and the kennels were so large and multi-leveled for the cats. There was a full kitchen for meal preps, and a bathroom with washing machines for blankets. No going up and downstairs. Everything on the same level. It was honestly my favourite part of the job. I always volunteered for the Sunday boarding shift because I was there alone for hours in the morning and evening. The various boarding cats kept me company. I'd been doing Sunday boarding for a few years at that point, and I had seen shadow people and heard things during both the day and the night, but nothing that ever put me on edge being there alone. That was until we had this experience. There was only one cat there that day, and he was my favourite. I would let him out of his kennel, and he would just follow me around as I cleaned and restocked stuff. That day, I wanted to air out the space, but the biggest window to use had no screens. So I opened the window, and Toby, the cat, and I went into one of the kitty free time rooms, and I shut the door behind us. I slid down the wall and sat on the ground next to the door. Toby came over for some love, before scratching a post and then sprawling out on the floor a bit away from me. I opened the book I brought with me and settled into a good read. Now, I must remind you, I was usually there alone. The hospital manager would come in on occasion to do payroll or make the schedule, but she always called me to open the door because she would forget her keys. And we had a bell on the front door so we could hear people coming in from everywhere in the hospital. That day, I was for sure alone. A few minutes into the silence of reading, I heard one of the floorboards in the hallway creak. Toby had heard it too, because he lifted his head and looked at the door. I remember saying something along the lines of, "It's okay, Tobes, just an old house." When the doorknob turned, I froze, staring at the knob. Nothing was happening, but someone had turned the knob and was still holding it. I looked for a shadow under the door and didn't see one. Still frozen, I felt something brush against my right arm and I let out a gasping yelp. I looked down and it was Toby, still trying to climb into my lap. Even though I just scared him, the knob was let go. We sat in silence for I don't even know how long. Eventually, I remember forcing my body to relax. Toby was still in my lap, staring at the door, ears back and body tense. So I made myself relax to try to calm Toby down. A few moments later, Toby had climbed off my lap and was laying next to me on my right, opposite the door, still looking over at it occasionally. I decided to start reading aloud to keep any other noises at bay. But after 10-ish minutes of me talking, the knob turned again and the door was pushed open. The door was not pushed open that wide, but enough for me to see out into the brightly lit hallway. I immediately stood up and froze. Toby had scattered to the far corner of the room and was letting out a low growl. There was no one in the hallway. No one was there, yet the doorknob was still turned. My mind was racing in that moment, trying to think of the appropriate reaction. What to do? How to stop it? All of a sudden I blurted out, "You're not allowed in here. Get out!" in a loud and surprisingly stern voice. The knob was let go, and in that moment, I stepped forward and pushed the door closed and held it there. I kept repeating in my head, "Get out! Get out! Get out!" Holding the knob still and the door closed, I called out to Toby to check in. I turned and looked around the room. I found him standing on my feet, hair on end. He was turned and staring to the back of the room at the corner he was just standing in. There was a half door on the back wall in the corner. It was for extra storage, full of litter boxes and various other cat-related stuff. It had been closed, but was now slowly swinging open. The door opened into the corner, so I couldn't see in. Every fibre of my being was screaming, "Run, you idiot!" But I couldn't. Toby was staying there, and I wasn't going to leave him there alone with whatever this was. My feet, apparently being the bravest part of me, moved forward. And then I was running full tilt and collided with the half door, slamming it closed. "You're not allowed, and are not welcome here. Get out now!" I bellowed. And then I just kept repeating aloud, "Get out!" Not in a loud voice, but a very controlled and certain one. I turned to look at the main door to make sure there was no more attempts at entry. I found Toby at my feet again, also watching the main door. I sunk to the floor, back against the half door, and Toby climbed into my lap. It took us over an hour to leave that room, and even then it was very reluctantly. Toby stuck right next to me as I cracked the door open and we peeked into the hallway. To our left was the open window. I took a breath, walked out into the hall right to the window, shut it and locked it. Toby stayed in the doorway looking down the hall in the other direction, towards the kitchen. Directly across the hall from the free time room was the kennel room where Toby was staying. The door was wide open and Toby darted across the hall into the kennel room. He ran not up to his cage, but up to his carrier. He was asking to not be left there and it hurt my heart. I wasn't going to do that, but how was I going to explain to my boss that A, the hospital is haunted, and B, Toby is scared, so I'm taking him home? I walked up to Toby and gave him a head pat. "I'm not leaving you here, bud," I remember promising him. I began packing up his stuff, grabbed a few toys and his blankets, and I was pouring the food in his bowl back into the bag when Toby let out a hiss and a ferocious growl. I spun around to see Tony right behind me, all puffed up and glaring across the hall to the room we were just in. The door was now wide open and the lights were off, which plunged the room into blackness. I turned back around to close the food bag and throw the food bowl into the other packed bag, when I heard loud, fast footsteps come towards our room. Toby let out a fearsome cry and charged forward like a cougar, and then quickly retreated to me. I yelled, "Stop! Get out! Go away! Leave us!" Get out now! Toby all the while growling and saying his piece next to me. We did that for minutes. Minutes. Demanding the thing to leave. Away. Out. Leave. Then the door across the hall slammed shut and started shaking. I grabbed Toby's food bag, grabbed Toby, and ran down the stairs and right out the door. Toby had freaked out when I grabbed him and was holding onto me with his nails, but I hadn't noticed until we had got into my car, and I was sitting in the back seat, detaching him from me. In the back of my car, Toby and I sat there stunned, catching our breath while I bled. I had to go back in to lock up. Thankfully, nothing happened. I set the alarm, locked the door, and left. I didn't go back upstairs at all. I left the rest of Toby's stuff where it was, his cage uncleaned, lights on, laundry machine running. I waited until I was home to call my manager. She wasn't happy. Some would have put her in the furious category, but she couldn't do anything at that time about it. The next day, I brought Toby back. Carried him in, purring in my arms. Thankfully, Toby's owners were back from their trip that day and came to pick him up. I told them that everything that happened, the complete truth. Mostly because the manager was being a right witch and pretty much forced me to, on threat of firing. But surprising to me, and I'm sure to my manager too, his owners were very understanding and even thankful to me for not leaving him there. They saw how much Toby trusted and liked me, and they trusted I did what I needed to for him. They're great people. Unsurprisingly, Toby did not like staying there from then on. They tried it again once more, and Toby was so stressed, so I took him home. Even to this day, Toby comes to stay with me whenever his owners leave town. He's a few years older now, but still such a character. The hospital manager finally got to fire me a few years later for not following a company policy, which I believe to be dirty and just rude. So I happily left there and got a job in a new, shiny hospital, working in the emergency care unit. I still see shadows here when working nights, but they've all been of cats or dogs. No human shapes. Let me start by saying that things like this always happened in my grandma's house, and we were already used to it at that point, and that I've changed the names of my family members for protection purposes. I'd always seen this spirit I called the tiptoe, because he used to tiptoe past the garage doorway with his finger to his lips like he was shushing me. He wore a baggy white t-shirt and frayed jean shorts. He never bothered me that much, just mildly freaked out enough that I had begged for the garage door to stay closed. The door never stayed closed though, and many people swore they didn't leave it open after they'd been in there, but that's beside the point. The worst incident I had with the tiptoe happened one night when there were only a few people in the house. I was about 5 or 6, and my Aunt Jackie was watching me, and my neighbour's kid who was 2 years older than me. His name was Tom. My aunt had some of her friends over and was sitting in her room talking about things like weird coincidences that were happening in the house. After we had begged her, she told me and Tom we could go get Trix yogurt, so we went to the kitchen to get it. Now the way this kitchen was set up was that there were 2 ends to it. Neither had doors on them, and to get out of the kitchen you had to walk through the living room. And at the end of the room facing into the kitchen was a garage door that always ended up open, unfortunately. So Tom and I were in the kitchen and I was holding the yogurt and he was looking for the right spoon. When from out of the corner of my eye, I saw Tiptoe, but the thing caused me to notice him is that this time he wasn't tiptoeing past. I looked at the doorway and noticed that a Tiptoe was standing in the garage doorway, glaring at me and pointing. I felt chills run down my spine and of course, Tom is still picking out spoons. I tug at his sleeve and he asked me what's wrong without looking up from the spoons. I tug on his sleeve again and this time I say his name. He tells me to hold on and keeps looking at the spoons. At that point, I've got my eyes on Tiptoe while tugging on his sleeve harder while practically yelling his name. Finally, he looks up and asks me what's wrong. I point to where Tiptoe stood, still glaring and pointing at me. He tells me to forget the spoons and run. We ran to my aunt's room as fast as we could and shut the door. I made a spoon out of the yogurt lid and Tom chugged it like a drink. Things continued to happen in that house until we moved, and I don't remember seeing Tiptoe after that. But to this day, I don't know if Tom saw what I saw or trusted me based on how scared I must have looked, and I hadn't got the chance to ask him. I also found out that the reason why things like that had happened in the house is because my aunt played with a Ouija board in the house. I've had a lot of paranormal experiences growing up, and I thought perhaps I could slowly begin sharing them. I was 6 years old, and I was trying to sleep in my own bed for once. Was tired of feeling watched in my mom's queen-size bed. The closet in that room unsettled me. I cuddled down into my princess bed and asked Dad to leave the door open. I was a smart kid, and I knew the shadows on the wall were just the cars outside flashing headlights into my room and making weird shapes. Then, one however wasn't a car. It formed quickly, a blink, and it was there in front of me. A solid figure of a man with a brimmed hat. He didn't even have a face, and I could feel him staring at me. I couldn't even move. I had never seen something so terrifying. He smirked at me, and not a single muscle moved on his smoke massive of face, but I knew what he was doing. He reached a hand up and tipped his hat. After that, he just got up and walked into the corner of my room, vanishing forever. I looked for logic, but I found none. This was my earliest encounter with a spirit that's undeniably a shadow man. I've seen dozens upon dozens more since then, but I haven't run across one with a hat since this incident. This happened about a year ago when I was 16 at my friend's house. It was me and my friend at T's house while her family was out, so it was just us. Her house wasn't quite in the middle of nowhere, but it was close to it. At the time of this encounter, it was around midday. Now, this house has always been haunted. I've had strange things happen to me since the day I first visited her there. To put into perspective for the story, her bedroom is on the second floor, but the second floor is her room. There's a little space at the top of the stairs for the balcony door on the right, and her bedroom door on the left. I would touch both at the same time if I spread my arms. There's nothing else up there. We were downstairs in her living room watching TV, eating snacks and such as usual. Now, I hadn't said anything to her because I didn't want to look crazy, but I felt unwelcome, if that makes sense. I felt like the longer we were down there, the heavier the feeling got. So I suggested we go back up to her room. I took our cups and went into the kitchen to wash them. Out of the corner of my eye, I see a dark, hunched-over figure run past me and into the laundry room. I thought it was T, so I turned around and audibly called out her name. She came in from the living room and asked what was up. I looked at her confused and asked if she had been in here. She seemed confused as well and said she hadn't been in here. She had been fixing the recliners. I told her what I had seen and her face just dropped. It was like one of those horror movie moments when you realise it was never your friend at all. We were spooked at this point and got out of Dodge, running upstairs to her room. We thought it would be over, but it was far from that. Now, T has a cat who hates people. You can't pet her, go near her, anything. She's never even in the same room as us when I'm over. Upon settling on T's bed and talking about what we saw downstairs, the cat began scratching on the door. So we let her in, and she bolts in with her hair raised and scrambles under the bed. Neither of us have ever seen that cat so afraid. This is when I stopped talking and I realised it sounded like somebody was walking around downstairs. I could hear footsteps and whispering. Then the cat wants to be let out. I didn't want to open the door because, to be honest with you, I was terrified at this point. But T didn't want the cat to pee on her floor, so she let her out. The cat got about halfway down the stairs when we heard her start to hiss and spit. The cat runs up the stairs, back into the bedroom and under the bed once again. This time, I lock the bedroom door. A few minutes later, T nudges me and says, "Do you see that?" I look over, and there's a moving shadow under her door, like somebody pacing back and forth. We were trying to distract ourselves until her parents got back from all the subtle noises, but it wasn't really working. Suddenly, we hear a big boom from downstairs. We both flinch and we're like, "What the fuck was that?" Then it happens again, but louder. It sounded like a door slam, or like something just ramming into the wall. It was so loud that we thought somebody had broken in. We can hear heavy boot steps and whispering downstairs. We're certain somebody has just broken into T's house. So scared, in fact, that we got out her bat and barricaded her door. You might be wondering why we hadn't called the police if we thought there was a break-in, but honestly, we weren't entirely certain. T's cell phone rings and it's her mom saying she's out front and to open the door because her hands are full. Neither of us wanted to go downstairs, but if her mom was there, surely nothing had happened. We crept down the stairs, waiting to see a destroyed house or things in chaos. But nothing. The doors and windows were locked and shut. Nobody was in the house. We let her mom in, and that was that. We searched the house, but there was genuinely nothing there. This is the clearest paranormal encounter I've ever had to this day. Years ago, when I was around 13 or 14 years old, my dad bought me a grandfather clock. The clock came from an estate sale. We didn't usually go to estate sales, but a lady in the neighbourhood had died, and we decided to check out the sale and see the house. The clock was in the foyer, and for some reason I was instantly drawn to it. I don't know why, but I had to have it. My dad first said no because it was very expensive, but I begged him for it, and he was able to negotiate the price down a good bit, and we took it home. We put it in our living room, and I always enjoyed looking at it and hearing the slow, quiet ticking. Years passed, and I went off to college. My dad died suddenly when I was 19. I'm 25 now, and I've had the clock in my own house since graduating. I'm now getting ready to move to a new city. I've packed up most of the house. One of the last things I did was prepare the clock to be moved. To remove a grandfather clock, you have to remove the pendulum and weights, secure the metal cables, and tape down certain parts in the mechanism. Just as soon as the clock parts were packed up, my house suddenly didn't feel like home anymore. It doesn't seem to have the same happy energy I always felt in it. I miss the soft sounds and motions of the clock. The clock just looks blank and lifeless now, and the house feels dead. Maybe even a little spooky. I feel this even as I type this from the master bedroom. The clock is in my foyer. Even if it were running, I wouldn't be able to hear it from here, but I still feel that it's not running. It's like the clock was a beacon of good energy, but I didn't realise it until it was missing. I can tell you one of the first things I'll do in my new house is reassemble the clock and start it back up. Girlfriend's sister's flat. I'm posting this on behalf of my girlfriend's sister, who would appreciate some advice from people who know what they're talking about. So she's just moved into a new flat around a week ago, which is above the pub she works at as a chef. Having looked into it, the pub was built in the 1700s, so has a fair bit of history to it. She was warned prior to moving in that the flat was supposedly haunted, with a common rumour that a gentleman who had sadly taken his own life in a large closet in the spare bedroom was haunting the place. She's had a fair few abnormal experiences so far. However, I'm sure a couple of them she'd readily admit is more likely a case of her getting it in her own head a bit. After all, if you're told a building is haunted, your first impression is likely going to be that it's creepy, and that will play on your mind. She's heard the sound of people talking and moving around downstairs in the pub the past 2 nights. Last night, she made the decision to check for people, but found nobody. but tonight didn't check as she was pretty creeped out already. Today, she saw her cat's hind legs lifted and moved position. She described it as though somebody had noticed it looking uncomfortable and moved it so it was in a more comfortable position. The cat itself has been seen pawing and growling and hissing at the door to the aforementioned closet, and seems to chase things around the flat. She's also told me that she's seen a man wearing a checkered shirt and glasses with short, brown hair outside the pub in the middle of the night, and said she almost thought it was her reflection, were it not for the fact that it looked nothing like her, as she has long blonde hair. I'm sure there's a couple of experiences here I'm forgetting to mention, but for now, I'll leave it at that. Now, as mentioned, before I think she'd admit that she's seen getting in her own head a bit about certain situations. And I think the talking and shuffling can be explained by the old building settling. It's winter at the moment, so the heating is working overtime, keeping the place warm, which can explain the shuffling, and perhaps even the talking. The cat pawing and hissing could also be explained by the fact he's not been introduced to that area of the flat too, so feels nervous about it. There are some experiences though, particularly the cat moving and the sighting of the man, that have spooked her. Again, these experiences aren't my own, and personally I'm a skeptic, so I won't really be offended by any comments that dispute the claims. What I'm looking for really is suggestions as to what she can do to reassure herself or calm herself down about all of this. As regardless of whether they're paranormal or not, it sucks to feel uncomfortable in your own home. I know she's never conducted a Ouija board session, seance, or any other spiritual activity. However, cannot speak for previous tenants. We moved here almost 4 years ago. My husband and I are both big-time skeptics, so we try to attribute everything happening to natural causes. Shortly after moving in, I started to see things out of the corner of my eye. I used to think my husband snuck downstairs and I was seeing him out of the corner of my eye, until I turned around and realised he was still upstairs. This was maybe a weekly occurrence, always just at the corner of my vision, like a man walking just out of view. My husband thought I was losing it, until one night in his office, he had his office door open and swore he saw someone running down the hallway towards his office door, until he looked up and no one was there. When my son was about 1, he would wake up crying and pointing to the same corner of the room. We kept asking him what was wrong, and he finally said bird girl. He was about 1.5 years old at the time and did this for months. Always in the same corner, always bird girl. Things have a way of breaking in this house. Electronics, appliances, nothing lasts like it should. I don't know if it's related, but it's sure as hell frustrating to have things just stop working. Lights also have a habit of flickering on and off, or just shutting off completely. Things like to turn on their own, especially in the playroom. The playroom is connected to the kitchen, as it's technically a dining room. One day, I was cooking and a toy randomly said, "Let's play." No one touched it. It had been sitting there for hours untouched. Creeped me out. Another toy is a house, and we sometimes hear the little door creaking open and shut. Probably the weirdest one. I was walking down the stairs one night and had this feeling like someone was behind me, watching you. I got this horrible pit in my stomach and heard someone say, "They're going to push you." I thought I was losing my mind. 1 week later, I fell down the stairs. I remember walking toward the stairs, and then I woke up the next morning. I had a concussion from hitting the gate at the bottom of the stairs with the back of my head. I still don't remember what happened at all, but I would have had to have fallen straight back to hit the back of my head on the gate the way I did. One night, I had dreamed someone was in the room holding me down, and the next day I woke up with bruises on my neck. No, it absolutely was not my husband. My husband was sleeping upstairs one night and felt like something sat on his chest. ended up spending a week in the hospital with a spontaneously collapsed lung. Doctor had no idea how it could have happened, just while sleeping. We've saged the house twice. Moving isn't an option for us right now. Saging seems to have helped at least a bit. I've tried to find the history on this land from before our home was built here, with no luck. We're the first owners. I don't even believe in ghosts, but there's been too much to deny something is weird here. So this has been happening for me for a while now. I live in Mexico with my parents, brother, and our 2 dogs. The house we live in isn't old or anything like that. In fact, my parents bought it when they got married, and since then, only 20 years have passed. Before we moved in, they rented it to a lady that was a little problematic and had to be evicted from the house because she didn't pay the rent for a year. After that, a year passed before we moved in here. Since I was a child, strange things have happened to me, in or out of the house. I suppose you could tell I have that 7th sense. One thing I remember a lot, it's one time in my childhood, I was about 10, where I couldn't sleep. I wasn't scared of the dark I was in, or the fact that everything was quiet. I just stared at the ceiling thinking God knows what, and wishing I could fall asleep. I then started to hear a very soft humming. It was like a woman's voice humming a lullaby. I was alone, and that wasn't my mother's voice, but I thought it might have been somebody outside. Then I remembered the time and the dead silence a few seconds before reigned on the street. Besides, the humming appeared to be more and more close. When I got to the point where I almost felt it in my ear, I ran as fast as I could to my parents' bedroom and just asked if I could sleep with them. Years passed and nothing strange happened. I switched rooms to the old studio, the place where the humming happened, and spent little time in it because of school. But now, because of the pandemic, I spend most of my time in it. And it's not that I can't be in the room. I really like how I've decorated it and feel it's like my personal space. But lately, I've been having weird dreams and strange things are happening. It all started again within a week, where all the nights I woke up at exactly 4:15 in the morning. I thought it was because of my insomnia, so I didn't pay much attention to that fact. But the week after that, I woke up from a very beautiful dream, to the scary feeling I was being watched by someone who was standing right in front of my bed. I was facing the wall and took several minutes to turn around and grab my phone to see it was 4:30 in the morning. I've never suffered from sleep paralysis, and I'm sure this wasn't my first time, because all the time I was facing the wall, I made sure I could move. Luckily, I didn't see anybody and eventually got back to sleep. But since then, mosquitoes just appear in my window in larger quantities each day. I always close my windows and door all day because I hate it when bugs enter, but somehow there's more and more. The funny part is that I don't hear or see them until the morning when I wake up and head to have breakfast. Last night, I had a very strange dream which got me thinking if this is just my imagination or something is really happening. In the dream, I was in my room with one of my dogs. I was staring at the window and didn't want to hop into bed like it always does. Suddenly, something grabs it by its collar and lifts it up, just so it's standing on its own 2 paws. Then I wake from bed and approach it to see what's going on, and the second I turn to see, there's a girl sitting on my bed. Then my father, who's very skeptical, enters my room and tells me I need to call a shaman or something to get rid of the ghost who's haunting my room. I'm really confused. Could it be just a bad dream? Should I seek help? I know so many people will want to say paranoia, psychosis, etc. And yes, I have experienced all of those. What I'm asking about is not that. This is for the people that know the difference between being sleep deprived for 5 days and hallucinating crazy things and actually seeing crazy things and knowing they are real. I know people say they talk with aliens and ghosts and other wild things on DMT, acid, shrooms, etc. My personal experience is from cocaine and crack. I did it for years. I was the closest thing to a functional crack addict someone could get. But we all know there's no such thing. To make a long story short, something attached itself to me for about 8 months. Years after my addiction began, mind you. I was terrified. Its presence was sinister. I could feel how much bad it wanted to inflict on me. Things would move on their own, computer chairs spin for no reason, things disappearing and reappearing, dogs and cats whimpering when I brought them to my room because I was too scared to be alone. Sleep with the lights on under the covers. My cat could literally be hissing and swatting at nothing, back hunched and hair curled up and all. When it was really bad, the room would fill with what I only describe as like an electromagnetically charged atmosphere. Random static charges would start zapping randomly on my body. And the air just felt, I don't know, like it was charged with electricity. I took a lot of videos and pictures, which was the only thing that kept me convinced I wasn't going crazy. That and my pet's fright. The pictures always turned out something. It's wild, because sometimes what my phone would show would not be at all what the saved picture or video was showing. The really, really good videos and pictures just wouldn't even be there when I'd go to look for them. After months of no harm coming from this thing, just straight terror, I realised if it was going to hurt me, it would have by then. It started becoming normalised in my life. I'd ask it to stop moving things, to leave me alone. I could literally go to bed with something like a cup or book floating on my nightstand. At this point, I started researching how to get rid of it and realised I had to face it. At about the 4-month mark, I confronted it, demanded it to leave me in the name of God, all the good stuff, yada yada. Well, sure enough, once I did that, the happenings started to become less frequent, each and every day, until it was eventually gone. Like it dissipated. It took 5 months to dissipate. I've been clean for years and live a very good life nowadays. This all occurred back in 2014.